Tipping expert and Cornell professor Michael Lynn tells us that approximately $45 billion change hands through tips every year. After decades of academic research on the practice, most people, from consumers to service workers to business managers, find themselves operating on instinct and intuition rather than evidence and research in order to understand and accommodate tipping behavior. I want to welcome you to Cornell Keynotes, everyone. I'm your host, Chris Wofford. Today, we are so pleased to be joined by Cornell professor Michael Lynn, who is author of the new book, The Psychology of Tipping: Scientific Insights for Services, Customers, Workers, and Managers. Welcome, Mike. Congratulations on the publication of your book. Lovely to see you again.
It's nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Viewers, we are interested in hearing from you today, and we'll, as we always do, we will take your questions in the chat. So please submit them in the chat function over on the right side of your screen. And we'll also share some resources, tools, and useful links. And also be sure to check out Mike's website called tippingresearch.com, where there's a slew of resources that Mike's provided with us, for us, that'll augment the conversation that we have today. We're also going to share a link to Springer Publishing, the book site, where there are several ways to learn more and purchase Mike's book if you like it. Audience, we need you to participate in a few poll questions as well. And we're going to be covering tipping. We want to get a sense of what your feelings are about tipping. So heads up for a QR code that will appear momentarily before we get into it here. So heads up for the QR code. As always, today's live stream is being recorded and will be available to view shortly after the show's over today at this same URL. All right, so let's dive in. Viewers, Mike and I have some questions for you before I start asking Mike some questions. So let's kick off here. Audience, what really drives you to tip? And I want you to be honest here. Is it guilt? I feel bad if I don't tip. Is it social pressure? I don't want it to look cheap. Genuine appreciation for good service? Or is it out of habit, social conditioning? It's just what you're expected to do. Or do you tip with the idea of getting better future service? So, Mike, while we wait for that to populate and wait for some of the input up from our audience, I want to ask you, how did you get into studying tipping?
Well, first off, I paid my way through school, waiting tables, bartending, being a busboy. And so that obviously gendered a certain interest in the topic. But it wasn't until I went to grad school that I began thinking about it as a research topic. And what happened was I showed up early to Columbus, Ohio. I went to Ohio State, got a job as a bartender. When the fall came around, had a research fellowship that prohibited me from holding another job. So I was supposed to quit and start this research fellowship. Unfortunately, I wouldn't get a paycheck until a month in. And so I asked my advisor, can I keep the bartending job just for the month to cover, and he said, yes, but only if you use this as an opportunity to look for research in that setting.
Yeah.
And that's actually the first time I began to think of tipping as a research topic. And ultimately, I did my master's thesis on tipping.
Can I ask you what program you were part of? I mean, how did this kind of fit into your academic studies?
I was a PhD student in social psychology. Social psychology is interested in how people influence one another. And my advisor had done a study a few years earlier finding that large groups of diners tend to tip less than individual lone diners. And so I ended up doing a study testing different explanations for that.
That's great. So much to get into. So the audience poll is kind of coming together. Let me tell you what I'm seeing here, Mike. 38% of our audience tips out of habit, out of social conditioning. It's just what you're expected to do. Genuine appreciation for good service coming in at 25% in the 2 slot. Guilt, also a motivator. That's number 3. Social pressure. And only 6% of our audience tips in order to bring about better future service. So I don't know, how do those numbers strike you? Is that a surprise, or what do you think?
No, I mean, first off, I think that those are the main reasons and motivations for tipping. So you've captured them in the options you gave people. What's interesting is these results reflect what I find to be true in general. People over appreciate the reciprocity or rewarding good service explanation. They think that that's one of the biggest and strongest reasons. Here, it's the second most popular reason for tipping. But in fact, when I stand outside of restaurants and interview customers about their dining experience and tipping behavior, I find that the customer's own rating of service only explains about 5% of the differences in tips left by different dining parties at that restaurant. It's more than you would expect by chance, so there is a tendency to tip more for better service, but it's incredibly weak. Um, in contrast, very few people say they tip for social pressure. But what research tells us is the biggest driver of tipping is bill size. Why? Because of the 15 to 20% norm. That's kind of not surprising. Maybe your listeners will be surprised to learn that it explains 70% of the differences in tips left by dollar and cent tip amounts left by different dining parties within a restaurant, which means it's twice as powerful as everything else combined. That why? Because of the social norm and the expectation, right? Um, the second biggest set of factors that influence tipping have to do with the social rapport and the connection between the server and the customer. Because then if you have that connection, you care what the server thinks of you. So when the two biggest drivers of tipping are the social norm that creates the server's expectations of what you're going to do, and your rapport with that person, so you care about their opinion, that tells me social approval is probably the strongest driver of tipping, even though it came in second to last in your poll.
Yeah, so from a social psychologist standpoint, is there something deeper going on here? You mentioned social pressure, sort of, the desire to establish a rapport with a server. Anything else going on there?
I don't know what you mean.
I'm thinking about behavioral psychology. If there's nothing there, we can move on, but I was just curious.
Um, Certainly, I can talk about some other motives. For example, social approval. I mean, if we want, we can get into. There's an anthropologist named George Foster who developed the theory that tipping is a way of forestalling the service workers' envy of us. Um,
Oh, yeah.
After all, when you're eating and drinking, you're having a good time, and this person that's serving you is toiling away at work. It would be natural for them to envy you. And we don't like people to envy us because who knows what they're going to do uh, to express that envy. Um, and so tipping, according to him, evolved as a way of saying, hey, don't envy me. Here's some money, have a drink on me after work. But why do we care about the service workers' envy? We want their approval. We don't want their disapproval, you know. So, I mean, that's an example of an enrichment and a little bit more detail about this thing that we had been talking about, social approval.
Yeah, I got you. So in your research, you've identified what you call the best and worst tippers. Can you describe these different customer profiles and what factors might make someone either generous or comparatively stingy with tips?
Sure. Let me start by saying what servers believe. Okay. Servers believe that the best tippers are regular customers, men, and wealthy people. They also believe that the worst tippers are foreigners, ethnic minorities, and old people. All right. In terms of consumers, most consumers think that tipping reflects the tipper's kind of happiness with the service, their kindness, their gratitude, uh, and all of those beliefs have a modicum of truth, except perhaps men are not better tippers than women. At least there's not good, consistent evidence of that.
Okay.
If the server's a female, men tend to tip better, but women tend to tip male servers better. Most of the others, there's some degree of truth to it. But I think the biggest lesson to be learned is that those group differences are very tiny and they're dwarfed by individual differences within those groups. So that, I'm just uncomfortable talking about this type of person is a big tipper. There are some statistical effects, but they're very tiny. And really, when you know how much someone tips, you know very little about that person, even their character. It's easy to assume, hey, he's a stingy tipper. He's just not a very empathic, caring person. Well, that's not true. There are lots of empathic, caring people who are poor tippers, and there are lots of good tippers who are not very empathic or caring. It, Tipping's not a window into the soul of the tipper.
I have a theory that service workers are the best tippers. Could you validate that? I used to work in food service for a long time. You did too?
Yeah. Former service workers do tend to tip slightly more than those who don't have that experience. But again, the same story. The differences are small and they're dwarfed by individual differences. There are plenty of former servers who are lousy tippers, and there are plenty of people who have never tipped who are great tippers.
I want to pivot a little bit and repoll our audience and ask a new set of questions, which takes us in a new direction, which I think is definitely top of mind for most people in our audience. Audience, here we go. So when you see those tablet tip screens at coffee shops and casual places, how do you typically respond, right? So you're being charged, the Square station gets flipped around, and you were given a series of percentages, recommended percentages to tip that person on. Do you? I tip the suggested amount to avoid awkwardness. I always hit no tip because this is tip creep gone too far. I tip less than I would have with cash or in traditional settings, or I actually tip more than I used to because of the suggestions themselves. So let's let this one populate as well. And let me ask you, Mike. Digital tipping, obviously has changed the landscape. Tablets are now asking for tips from everywhere, from coffee shops, retail stores, counter service places that previously, movie theaters, right, hadn't previously had tip structures and offerings in place. How has this shift altered tipping behavior and consumer psychology? What's going on out there? What is it doing to people? I hear frankly, a lot of
Sure.
bitterness on the consumer
A
side.
lot of, yeah, the digital tipping requests have increased social pressures on consumers to leave tips. And I think they've done so in four ways. First, these digital requests typically come with suggested one-touch tip options. And that's a new thing. In the past, we knew there was a norm that you're supposed to tip 15 to 20%, but when you got your bill, even your credit card slip didn't typically have those options listed, right? And so there's an explicit expression, not just that they want to tip, but how much to tip, that is a new thing. And that puts more pressure on people. Um, Often these digital devices that you're responding to require you to make that decision in front of the recipient of the tip. And that increases social pressure. Also, these digital devices turn what had been a sin of omission, if you decide not to tip, you just didn't tip. I failed to give you a tip. That's a sin of omission. Now I have to hit a button that says no tip for you, buddy. And that's a sin of commission. And since we judge people more based on sins of commission, that increases social pressure. And the final thing is, these digital tip requests hide information in a way, for example, that tip jars didn't. A lot of these digital requests are coming in the context of counter service. We've had requests for tips in counter service before in the form of a tip jar. But it's easy to see whether other people are putting money into a tip jar. And it's easy to see how many people over the course of the day have done it by looking at how full the tip jar is. In comparison, it's hard to see what button. So you may be afraid the person behind you is overlooking your shoulder when you hit that button, but the fact is they're not, and it would be hard for them to see how much you're going to tip. And the display screen doesn't tell you. Here's the cumulative tips left so far. So people have this assumption they wouldn't be asking or if it wasn't normative. And without the empty tip jar to say, yeah, they're asking, but people aren't doing it, they don't have information to counter that assumption. And all of these make us feel more pressure to tip. Do you want me to keep going, or do you have results? What's
Well,
the
I have an interesting comment from viewer A who says I tip because servers' minimum wage is $10.70 an hour. The tips allow them to make an acceptable wage. Not necessarily offered in our choices here, but I thought it was interesting to note, right? Just an
right?
empathetic understanding of what that service worker is dealing with from an employment perspective.
Yes, but that's kind of irrespective of digital tipping, right? And when we started talking about what motivates tipping, altruism and the desire to help servers make a living is a very common and important reason for it. Um, Getting back just to digital tipping, we know, for example, how does it affect behavior? The larger the tip options, the more people leave. Uh, they're less likely to leave a tip. If you start asking for larger and larger amounts, more people will just say, forget it. But the people who do tip will go ahead and give you those larger amounts, and the net effect on tip income is that it goes up. And so this is contributed to people asking larger and larger amounts because it's effective. Okay. And the fact that it's effective in environments where it didn't used to be. Counter workers in the past could put out a tip jar, but they didn't stay up long because customers refused to put money in, right? These digital requests, for the reasons I described, are more effective in getting at least some people to leave tips. And since some people are leaving tips, they go ahead and keep the digital request going. Um, and customers don't see how few other people are tipping. And so they feel more pressure and they're more likely to leave money. So the way that imposes social pressure causes a little bit more tipping, which encourages businesses to start asking for tips in environments where they haven't before. That's part of why we have tip creep. Okay. And we have the tipflation asking for larger and larger amounts because the data tell us the more you ask, the more you get. But all of this has created a backlash, what's called tip fatigue. I've studied this for a long time. Back in 2016, only about 32% of people that I asked said they wanted tipping abolished. When I repeated that same survey to a similar sample of people in 2022, it was 52% of people said that they'd like to see tipping abolished. So it puts pressure on people. It's contributed to tip creep. It's contributed to tipflation, which results in tip fatigue. The one thing that I think is important to remember is it's changed tip request more than it's changed actual tipping behavior. Okay, that digital makes it easy to ask for a tip, and so people are doing it. But just because people are asking doesn't mean people are giving. Almost every restaurant today will ask you for a tip when you order carry out for a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Only about 25% of people say they even sometimes tip that, or that they typically would tip that. So if 75% of the population is saying, no, I usually don't tip for carry out, it's not normative. Behavior hasn't changed as much as the request have.
Hey, can we speak about the request a little bit? Me and some of the guys on the crew were talking about this. You know, it seems that almost invariably what we're presented with as far as tip options go are 18%, 20%, 22, or custom tip, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those numbers are kind of built around that accepted 20% for table service, restaurant, hotel, bar kind of thing. Is that due to inflexibility in platform? Can the manager play around with Square and say, let's just do 10%, 15%, et cetera?
Oh, sure.
What's going on there?
No. Well, yes, the platforms will enable you to choose the options that you want, right?
Okay.
It's even possible to choose a dollar amount rather than a percentage amount.
Oh.
And some of the systems will charge a dollar amount if it's a small bill, and on a larger bill, it converts to a percentage amount. So there's considerable flexibility in what the systems can present you. Um, Look, managers are going to present options that will generate the most income for their servers with the least consumer resentment. And so what the options they're giving you tells you something about their perceptions of how much they can get out of you without upsetting you.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that. So I want to ask you this. Some jobs, and we've talked about this a little bit up till now, some jobs have strong tipping cultures while others don't. Why do we tip restaurant servers but not fast food workers, even though we kind of are now in some cases? Hairstylists, but not retail clerks. What determines which jobs are tippable? What have you found in your research? What are you seeing out there?
Okay. Yeah. So what we do is we get a collection of 100 or more service occupations and get people to indicate how likely they are to tip those providers, and also other different people to rate each of those occupations on various dimensions or characteristics and see what predicts. What do we find? We're more likely to tip an occupation if the customer finds it easier to evaluate service performance than the manager. Okay. So, for example, a manager observes that a server is not approaching a table very often. Is that inattentive, poor service, or is that good service because the table is having an intimate conversation and doesn't want to be interrupted? Management can't tell, customers can easily tell. And in situations where the customer is a better evaluator of service than managers, we're more likely to tip. Right? Um, we're more likely to tip workers that are low income and low status, uh, probably because we're more confident they won't be offended by the offer of a tip, right? Um, Hedonic disparity. We're more likely to tip if the customer is happier than the service worker and not when the reverse is true. For example, I don't tip my dentist because I'm miserable and he's doing his calling, right? Um, Same with a lawyer or whatever. Uh, but if I'm having a good time and they're working, doing grudging menial work, I'm better, I'm happier. I'm going to be concerned about their envy. I'll tip more, right? Um, if we control for status, the more customized the services, the more likely we are to tip, which makes sense if tipping is at least in part a reward for service. I don't need to reward customized service. Standardized service. But if it's customized, then also it's customized service that the customers got this monitoring advantage we had discussed previously. Some of the most interesting and counterintuitive to me findings are that we're actually more likely to tip people if we're not going to encounter that service provider again in the future, and if we have little face-to-face contact time. That is, there are certain occupations where you interact for a long time, and there are certain occupations where you're likely to see the same service provider. I think of your doctor. You go into your doctor, you're talking to them, they're examining you, and you keep the same doctor for years and years, right? We don't tip those people. Presumably, I can tell you we don't tip those occupations. I can only speculate as to why. But I think it is when we have a lot of face-to-face contact and a lot of repeated interactions, we start to think of our relationship with those people as social. And we don't want to contaminate that with the commercial money, is my suspicion.
Yeah, I love it. Mike, we never sorry if I'm off ramping too early here. Did you have a follow up point? Sorry.
No. That's fine.
We never reviewed the results from our audience
Yeah.
when we asked them, when you see those tablet tip screens at coffee shops and casual places, how do you typically respond? Here's how the responses came in. 41%
Wow.
said I tip less than I would have with cash or traditional settings. 41% tip less. 37% always hit no tip. This is tip creep gone too far. 19%, considerably less, I tipped a suggested amount to avoid awkwardness. And 4% say I actually tip more than I used to because
Uh-huh.
of these suggestions. Does this line up with some of your research findings?
So first off, I've never studied this, but there have been a number of other surveys asking people about this. And one survey produced results I qualitatively the same. That is, people saying, yeah, they don't like it. They're less likely to tip. When they do tip, they tip less than they would have otherwise. That's not an aberrant finding.
Hmm.
But I've also seen surveys where people say, no, I wouldn't have tipped, but I go ahead and tip, or I tip more than. And so I've seen surveys on both sides of this, and I don't know where the truth lies, to be honest with you.
Right. Hey, I want to flip to the management side. We haven't really talked about that. We've been talking about the consumers, employees, people, frontline service, right? But what effect does these developments in tipping, the creep, as we've been talking about, what effect do they have on businesses that employ people who are now getting tips that previously maybe weren't? What is the business effect of this?
Wow. So, I mean, one of the reasons that businesses are willing to ask for these tips is that it is a relatively low cost way to boost pay. Remember, we came off of COVID and there was an we had full employment. Getting employees was hard, but to do that, you typically have to pay more. The problem is we're also in a period of high inflation and consumers are very sensitive to price increases. How do I pay more? I'm paying higher other costs. How, how and yet I don't want to raise prices on my customers. Tipping is a way of saying, hey, if you want to tip my workers, that's great. I appreciate it very much. It'll help me attract more and better people. If you don't have to pay it, right? It's a way of getting wealthy and price insensitive customers to subsidize the dining of less wealthy or more price sensitive customers. Um, and that's part of why businesses are doing this now. The problem is that customers hate it. And so you're alienating some of your customers. Uh, Now, as long as everybody else is making those same requests and you're not suffering relative vis-a-vis your competition. Um, but I think that's a lot of the psychology of what's going on from a business perspective.
Exactly. So, what is, this is interesting too, because this brings up a couple other issues from a business management perspective. You are making the jobs more attractive to potential employees, and you're also trying to strike a balance between that and keeping the customers happy. There's two sides of it. I mean, how does management think about this? Can you say broadly whether this introducing tipping in areas where it hadn't existed before, do you think it helps or hurts businesses? That's a lot.
That it is a lot. I think it probably does more harm than good. Remember, I just described a bunch of characteristics of tipped occupations. If you have an occupation and workers who don't meet those characteristics and you start asking for tips, it's not you'll get some people to tip just out of social pressure, but there's not going to be this natural inclination and you're not going to get a lot of people tipping. Like I said, only 24% of people say that they usually tip for restaurant carryout. I don't think that's going to change a whole lot because it's pretty standardized service. All okay. Um, Even baristas, we've been asking for tips and for a long time, but about half of customers say they don't usually, or only about half say they usually tip for coffee shop. You're acting like that. You're surprised. I don't tip for baristas unless I ask for something special.
Right.
But if I'm getting a pastry and a regular coffee, I don't tip. And guess what? Half of the U.S. population refuses to tip in that case too. Um, So you're not getting a whole bunch of money when you ask for tips in these new contexts. You are alienating customers. Uh, and I don't I don't have any I have good data on what customers say they feel. Whether it actually changes their behavior is hard to say. right?
Yeah.
Because after all, I may be pissed at this coffee shop for asking me, but it's the most convenient place for me to stop on my way to work. And I'm just not going to change. I may not be happy, but so
Yeah.
the good behavioral data, I'm not aware of any. I am aware of lots of data showing that customers are upset and they say they're less likely to patronize those establishments. And I'd at least be concerned enough about that if I was a business that I'd be very reluctant to try to expand tipping to new occupations, especially because if they don't have characteristics of tipped occupations, you're not likely to be successful anyway. And if they do have the characteristics of traditionally tipped occupations, they're probably already being tipped, right?
That's right. Sound advice, and definitely something to be considered for business owners and managers who have to think about this stuff. For many years, you've researched the controversial sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. What has the evidence shown you about whether this system actually benefits or harms service workers? What's the deal
Okay. Well, sub-minimum wages presumably increase employment opportunities, right? Because I can hire more workers if I not have to pay them as much, right? And if I have to start paying more, I'm going to cut back on hours. I'm going to cut back on number of employees. So as a collective, service workers benefit from increased employment opportunities with lower minimum wages. Um, but of course, they're getting less income. I mean, less regular income. They're getting tips. People have argued that the subminimum wage contributes to worker poverty and people needing to go on welfare and so forth. I have a hard time buying that because all of the subminimum wage laws stipulate that you get away with the subminimum wage only if it's made up for in tips. Okay. And so if there's, I'm sure that there are cases where many tipped workers are, on welfare and living in poverty, but that has as much to do with the number of hours they work, with the low skill nature of their work. It's not the sub minimum wage that's responsible. Okay. Because ultimately tips are making up for that sub minimum wage, bring it at least to the minimum, or they wouldn't be lawful to give them that sub minimum wage. I've also heard people say that the sub minimum wage increases sexual harassment because it makes servers more dependent on tips than they would have otherwise be. And if you're dependent on tips, you're going to put up with more from customers than you otherwise would have. I have no doubt that tipping encourages sexual harassment. I'm not so sure the sub-minimum wage impacts it. There is some data. One Fair Wage, for example, in their brochures and website will talk about research showing that states with a lower tipped minimum wage have higher levels of sexual harassment. But that's higher levels of sexual harassment of both tipped and non-tipped workers. So I think it's something to do with the culture. Whether it's, ultra conservative states are less likely to want to increase the tipped minimum wage, and those ultra conservative people are more likely to sexually harass. I'm just making something off the top of my head. I don't really mean to disparage. I'm just trying to point out there's a reason that states with low tipped minimum wages have more sexual harassment, but it's not because the low minimum wage encourages or enables sexual harassment. If that's what was going on, we'd see more sexual harassment of tipped workers, but not more sexual harassment of untipped workers. And it's both groups, right? So the data just don't support the idea that the tip minimum wage hurts workers by making them more subject to sexual harassment.
Yeah. Thanks for that considered answer. I mean, yeah, totally fascinating. Could go on. That could be its own conversation, right?
Sure.
I want to talk about tip pooling, and I want to together maybe we can describe what it is. But in short, um, uh, as part of the culmination of nightly operations, everyone's tips are pooled together and then distributed among staff, not only front of house staff but back of house staff. And let's talk about. No,
Okay.
go ahead. No, you go.
Well, okay. We need to make a distinction between tip pooling, which is all tips go into a common pool and get distributed according to some formula. All right. That's tip pooling.
Hmm.
There is a related thing called um, tip sharing.
Okay.
Tip sharing is pretty common. Uh, Restaurants will typically require servers to share a portion of their tips with the bartender who has made the drinks for that table, with the busboy who's cleared that table, etc.
Hmm.
And there may be rules about how much you should share, but the bulk of the tip is kept by the server. And one server's not okay. Tip pooling is it all goes into a common pool and gets distributed by formula.
Got it. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, Tip pooling is relatively rare in this country. It
Hmm.
does exist, and it's big cities like New York City are going to have more tip pooling than elsewhere. It's look, there are people, um, you know, the concern is that if you have tip pooling, you're removing the incentive value of tipping, right? If I don't have to deliver good service anymore, as long as my fellow workers are delivering good service, the pool will be great and I'll take home plenty. Uh, there's some research looking, but not like literally one or two studies, and they come up with slightly different results. I mean, there's some evidence that if servers are able to observe one another, they'll police the system and get on the shirkers. And so it doesn't reduce service as long as the workers themselves can monitor one another's behavior. But if you're working in an off room where people can't see what you're doing so much, then under a pool system, you'll shirk more. You'll give lower service. Um, what I can tell you is that servers don't like tip pooling. They think they can get better tips than their others, and they want that opportunity. And customers don't like tip pooling. They give tips to the person who waited on them, and that's the person they want to receive that money. So my best advice is don't do tip pooling. Um,
Okay.
but most people in this country don't. Tip sharing is more common. Tip pooling
Yes.
is not.
God, good. Thank you for that answer. I have a question from Michelle. You and I talked about this a little in our pregame, and it's kind of the elephant in the room, but Michelle is curious if you've only studied the tipping habits of Americans. She's noticed that Europeans don't generally believe in tipping. They think you should pay a better wage. You answered the same question I had for you with.
Um, I've mostly studied tipping in the US because that's what I'm used to. I have looked at national differences in tipping customs and what predicts that. Why is tipping so common in countries like the US and other countries like Scandinavia? It's pretty rare. But as far as individual decisions about tipping, I live and work in the United States. I've limited myself to the US. Other people have studied tipping in these other contexts, and for the most part, the results generalize. What we find in the United States is generally true in other countries.
Good. Thank you for that question, Michelle, or that comment. Okay, I find this part fascinating. You've traced how American tipping evolved from 10% in the early 1900s, 15% mid-century, getting up to 20% by the year 2000. We're now seeing suggestions of 25% or higher. Is there a natural ceiling to this tipflation, or do you see it kind of continuing indefinitely? Where are we going with this?
Wow. Okay, so first off, the data I have show a linear increase over time. It wasn't increasing and then that increase gets smaller and smaller. It's a constant increase, which suggests that it's going to continue to go up. Having said that, it just I have a hard time believing that's going to go up indefinitely. There has to be a ceiling somewhere. Where that ceiling is, I don't know, and neither does anyone else, to be honest with you. If I had to guess, I would guess that we're very close to that ceiling today, that it's somewhere in that 20 to 25% range. But I've got to be honest, that's a guess.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
I
yeah.
think the way it's always been too, we've never conceived that it could, oh my gosh, someday it could go to 15%, right? I mean, there was a time
Yeah.
where people thought that was preposterous. No way,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
All
Yeah.
right, so if we talk about like the growing tip fatigue, you had mentioned to me in our planning call that you believe that tipping will never go away. So what makes you so
Yeah.
confident about this prediction, especially when other countries have successfully moved away from tipping? There's been some movement within the U.S. for this, but what are your thoughts?
So first off, I'm not, yes, I guess they moved away from tipping, but they moved away from tipping early in the history of tipping, right?
Uh-huh.
For example, the argument is that we borrowed tipping from Europe, that Americans traveling abroad brought the custom back. And so tipping used to be more common in Europe than it was in the United States, and the reverse is true today. So yes, those European countries aren't leading the tipping movement the way they used to. Um, but that was a long time ago. Um, why do I think we're unlikely to change? I think it's really two primary things. First off, many US consumers still like tipping. Yes, 52% in one survey I did pretty recently would want to get rid of it, but there's still a large number of people who enjoy tipping. It makes them feel good to help another person, to express their generosity or to show off, or they get some benefit, psychic benefits from tipping. And they're going to continue to do it. And when they do it, it's going to put pressure on other people who don't like it as much to keep tipping.
Yeah.
So the fact that there are a substantial number of consumers who like it, or it's going to make it hard to change. The other factor is that even though many people also dislike tipping, the alternatives are liked even less. If I get rid of tipping as a business, I have to raise I have to pay my servers more, which means I have to generate more revenue, because I promise you, restaurants are not making such a high profit that they can just eat that extra cost. What are the options? It's either service inclusive menu pricing, so up my menu prices,
Hmm.
or it's adding an automatic service charge. Both of those are less popular options. People hate service charges. That's the worst decision to do,
Yeah.
right? Because they view it as a mandatory tip. If you think I don't like tipping, telling me I have to tip is even worse. Okay.
Hmm.
So that's not the solution. And you would think service inclusive menu pricing. Some customers say they want that. But lots of research I've done and some of my students shows that when we evaluate restaurant expensiveness, we look at the menu prices and we don't take into account whether the tip is expected or not. So a no tipping restaurant with higher menu prices is going to be perceived as more expensive. And that's going to hurt their business. And it's also going to make the customers less satisfied. And indeed, again, we've got a number of restaurants that have tried to eliminate tipping. What we find is their online ratings go down when they do. Um, so the fact that the alternatives are worse than tipping and that a substantial number of people like tipping, that's why I don't think it's going away.
That's a really good point. I've been to a couple of places where the tipping cost was built into menu prices. Same thing. We all kind of love it. Not we all. There are those among us who love the concept. But then you get there, right? And it's also the job of the restaurant, maybe the server, who knows, to kind of explain this. It adds a layer of complexity that maybe detracts from the experience altogether. Are there success stories related to the elimination of tipping and building those costs into the menu? I mean, your research
No, I
suggests
was,
otherwise, but I don't know.
well, okay. From the standpoint of customers,
Yeah.
what I did find was really upscale restaurants could replace tipping with service-inclusive menu pricing and not see their online ratings go down.
Got it.
Presumably because they're really upscale, their customers are less price sensitive, and a lot of that decrease in customer satisfaction is due to higher menu prices, right? Um, and it just doesn't bother rich people who go to upscale restaurants as much.
Yeah.
But having said that, Danny Myers is an upscale restaurateur in New York City.
Yeah.
And by the way, he was one of my sample. His online ratings didn't go down. And I feel bad talking about someone's business when I'm not them. I'm repeating what I've heard, not what I've directly experienced. But my understanding was the problem that he ended up having to go back to tipping.
Oh.
But not so, because his customer ratings went down, but because it's hard to keep servers. He made a conscious effort to say, "Look, I'm going to pay you so that you'll get as much as you were getting in tips." And I believe he successfully did that. The problem was that this was a period of time when wages were going up, prices were going up. And because prices were going up, tip income was going up everywhere around him. Yes, his servers were making what they used to, but if they went somewhere else, they could make more than they used to. And so he was losing staff. So yeah, now I forgot.
That was the example
question,
actually that I was thinking of. I mean, Danny Meyer is kind of the gold standard for this kind of thing, or
he
the
was
reference.
unable. Yeah, and he was unable to make it work long term. I mean, it was working for a while, but long term it didn't.
Goodness. Hey, audience, time to wake up. We've got another question for you. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you choose for tipping culture? So we've got a little bit of audience input coming here. I want to tell you, would you tell us a little bit about your book, who your audience is? It's interesting because I get a sense that we have hospitality people in here. This is a general interest topic. We all have stake in it. It's broadly interesting to most of us. A lot of us talk about this stuff all the time. How about your book? Is this an industry book or otherwise?
I wrote it for 3 audiences, and they're in the title. Services customers. I want them to come away feeling empowered, having some guidance and assurance how to navigate the complex and evolving expectations that are being placed on them. It's also for service workers. I want them to know how to get better tips. And I also want them to understand that some of the tactics that they're trying or some of the things they're doing may not be as effective as they think. And then finally, I do want to speak to managers because they want to increase pay to their employees, but also satisfy customers. And do I have a magic bullet that I can give you the formula? No, but there are lots of research findings and general principles that are presented in the book to help everybody do each of those things. Customers to take control of their own behavior, servers to earn more, and managers to get both happier servers and customers.
I have 2 things interesting going on my side related to kind of what you talked about there, Mike, unless I interrupted you.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, good. This is from Isabel, who says, I want to tip for good service, but not to incentivize the employers to pay their servers less. Do you recommend we all stop tipping to reset the authenticity of this practice? Hold up. There's 2 parts to this. And we asked the audience, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you choose for tipping culture? Audience, 53% of our audience, that's a large chunk, suggests we eliminate tipping entirely, just pay fair wages up front. Number 2, let it evolve naturally. 3, keep the current system, that's down at 18%. No one said expand tipping to more service jobs for worker flexibility.
Right.
So 2 things there, right? Both Isabel
First
and
off,
the audience.
notice that that's 53%. I told you in my study in 22, it was 52%.
There you go.
So
yeah.
That's consistent with my own research. Let me just interject what I would do.
Yeah.
Which was not to change tipping culture directly, but to eliminate the tip minimum wage. Because if there was no tip minimum wage, people would feel less pressure to tip to ensure a living wage for those workers.
Yeah.
And that would allow them to start being more discriminating and to return tipping to a reward for good service. Um, if I was a business, I would start posting on my menus, on the bottom of the check. It is customary to tip 15 to 20%. That is still the norm in this country. I would want to stop this increase in tipping because it's going to hurt businesses in the long run, right? Uh, First off, it increases pay disparities between front of house and back of house staff. And I can't just raise prices, I can't just raise the wages of the back of house, because to do that, I have to increase menu prices. And once I do that, people are tipping a percentage, the servers make more, right? But it's also increasing the cost of going out to eat to customers if they have to tip more and more. And that's maybe part of the reason we're seeing restaurant dining. I mean, some of it is people learned during COVID they didn't have to go out and they still survived, and they found other ways to have good meals. But some of it has to do with the costs are so high today. And this continued growth in tipping expectations is only going to hurt businesses. They've got to help put a stop to that growth. I would say we've had this 15 to 20% norm since at least the late 1950s. That's, Emily Post was saying you tip 15 to 20% in the late 1950s. Let's just stick at that. And I think restaurants and other businesses should help facilitate our sticking with that by reiterating and repeating, this is the norm and expectation, and only doing that for traditionally tipped occupations. That's what
Solid prescription. Yeah, I appreciate it. Audience, heads up, we're going to share the URL to Michael Lynn's book, The Psychology of Tipping, in the chat here if you wanted to check that out. And I also want to let you know that a lot of what we covered today in our conversation, like hospitality operations, service concepts, a lot of what we talked about maps to course content, which is taught in the Hospitality Management Certificate Program. So we'll share some links to some of the online education courses and certificate programs that are offered at Cornell University for you in the chat as well. Mike Lynn, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Cornell Keynotes today. Again, congratulations on the publication of the book. We could go on forever, but I love what we discussed today.
Good. Thank you for having me. I had fun.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, viewers. Again, note that this is live, but the recording will be available shortly after this. And we're going to also pop up our link tree in case you like to connect with us on other platforms. LinkedIn Live, Facebook Live, YouTube, etc. So thank you for joining us for today's keynote. Talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone.